There will be, in the next generation or so, a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak. Producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies, so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it, because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda and brainwashing, or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. And this seems to be the final revolution. We are watching Huxley's vision of a dystopian, brave new world controlled by state-sanctioned addiction unfold right before our eyes. And sure enough, we rather enjoy it. The only surprise is that the pharmacological agents he warned against aren't delivered in pill or liquid or other physical form. And we don't call them soma or heroin or crystal meth or crack. They're delivered in bits and bytes instead, and we call them media.
In the early 21st century, we witnessed the emergence of what I call an irrefutable, state-sanctioned meta-addiction to all things media and all things digital as the default social condition, the rule rather than the exception. In the early 21st century, we normalized late-stage addiction.
Today and tomorrow, we will devote at least 75% of all our waking time, at least 3 out of every 4 minutes, to media consumption. Today and tomorrow, more and more of our time will be spent with media. More and more of it will be spent in isolation, away from other people, including and especially the people we love. Today and tomorrow, we will wake up in the morning to digital media and go to sleep at the end of the day to digital media. Today and tomorrow, our children will be raised as digital media addicts by digital media addicts. Today and tomorrow, a state-sanctioned meta-addiction to all things media and all things digital will rule and control our lives, all with our blessings.
When I was growing up in the 1950s and 60s, we were ashamed to admit how much TV we watched. We called it the boob tube and the idiot box. We ridiculed it in public, but cherished it in private. Today, half a century later, we boast about binge viewing and call ourselves news junkies. We speak casually about our addiction to TV shows, electronic games, social media, and smartphones, and dismiss any potential downsides as alarmist and yesterday's news. Today, we are born into and live our entire lives, cradle to grave, in a completely immersive, entirely addictive, and all but inescapable screen culture. Today, addiction is the new normal.
We carry pocket-sized TV screens with us everywhere we go, and more screens of various sizes greet us wherever and whenever we pause. At home, in our bedrooms, kitchens, and living rooms. At work, in elevators, reception areas, and atop every desk. On the road, in gas pumps, airline seats, taxis, airports, and train stations. At play, in bars and restaurants. In school, in the doctor's office, and just about everywhere else.
Of course, none of this just happened by accident. We didn't just wake up one morning to discover that we'd become a nation of digital media addicts. Neuroscience tells us that our brains are chemically motivated to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. In essence, we're chemically predisposed to addiction, a fact not lost on social media, game, and digital device designers. Every day, in high-tech centers across the nation and around the world, tens of thousands of extremely bright, extremely capable, and highly motivated and ambitious young minds apply their time and talents to a singular task on behalf of the world's largest and most powerful drug cartel. Although their individual job descriptions will never admit as much, their collective mission in the digital 21st century is abundantly clear: to manufacture and market a pervasive meta-addiction to all things media and all things digital. We might also want to ask ourselves why so many high-tech CEOs and visionaries won't expose their own children to the same digital devices and games they sell like candy to everyone else's kids.
Of course, it's not the first time in our history that legitimate industries and their paid proxies at all levels of government have consciously and deliberately enlisted addiction as a marketing and sales strategy. The food, tobacco, casino, pharmaceutical, advertising, and marketing industries have all relied on the mechanisms of addiction as primary marketing and sales tools for decades.
Over the next 3 years alone, more Americans will die from smoking and obesity-related disease than have died in all of our wars. We can no longer dance around the fact that the addiction actively promoted by legitimate industries and government leaders have killed tens of millions of Americans over the past few generations and will doubtless kill tens of millions more in generations to follow. But of all the legitimate industries that have chosen over the decades to deploy addiction as a marketing and sales strategy, none has been more pernicious, more ubiquitous, more influential, more successful, and more profitable than the digital media and digital device industries. Although it's entirely true that a handful of high-tech elites now shape how we feel and what we think, they can do so only because they in fact produce far more media than technology. Apple sells more music than any other company on earth. Amazon and Facebook and Spotify and Netflix and Google all sell more media and advertising than technology. In fact, Google and Facebook alone sell more online advertising than all other companies combined. Meanwhile, YouTube curates and delivers far more video than Comcast, Disney, CBS, Fox, or Time Warner. And Amazon, the world's largest online retailer, now owns the Washington Post. Say what you want about their technology, there can be no doubt that the primary focus of these self-proclaimed high-tech companies is media, not technology. And their primary product is addiction. Sure enough, George Orwell's terrifying vision of a big brother who ruled by fear with an iron fist was eclipsed in the early 21st century by Aldous Huxley's far more insidious reality of a society ruled and controlled by state-sanctioned addiction. Turns out that Huxley, not Orwell, was right all along. He just had the wrong drugs. The secular high-tech theocracy of the brave new digital world requires us in no uncertain terms to accept as an article of religious faith that our digital tools and technologies will forever improve the quality of life for us and our children. The media drug lords and the high priests of the brave new digital world tell us without respite that all the answers to all of our questions and the solutions to all of our problems are only a click or a swipe away. All we have to do, or so they tell us, is stay tuned. Now, barely one generation into the brave new digital world, and despite unlimited 24/7 access to the secrets of financial success, the science of health and nutrition, and the keys to personal empowerment, we find ourselves poorer and deeper in debt, fatter with epidemic levels of degenerative disease, time-starved, chronically sleep-deprived, and far more anxious and fearful than ever before. What went wrong? One of the more reliable promises of consumer technologies over the past few generations has been the promise of increased leisure time, an essential component to the quality of life. I remember back in the 1970s and 80s when serious people talked seriously about moving to a 4-day work week. We asked ourselves, what can we possibly do with all this leisure time? Turns out that question was a tad premature, because no one, at least no one with a job, has more leisure time today than they did before the digital pipeline and the internet opened for business in the mid-1990s. No one's life has slowed down since then. In fact, chronic time starvation is the single most common complaint among citizens of the brave new digital world. Perhaps that's because not one of the digital gadgets we carry around with us in our day-to-day lives was designed to increase leisure time or improve the quality of our lives. Not one. Perhaps it's because our laptops, tablets, and mobile phones all started out as digital office productivity tools and were all designed specifically to accelerate and enhance productivity. Not one was designed to increase leisure time. Not one was designed to improve the quality of our lives.
Social time that we once spent together at the dinner table with our families is now all but gone. Social time that we once spent together in quiet worship or relaxation on a Sabbath day of rest is now all but gone. Social time that we once spent together as families gathered around the radio or TV at night is now all but gone. Time that we once spent in the morning with a quiet cup of coffee and a newspaper is now all but gone. Time that we once might have spent in quiet contemplation and critical thought is now all but gone. Instead, we lavish almost all of our waking time at work and at play on all of our time-saving digital devices.
I remember talking about the demise of the great American Metro daily newspapers with the former CEO of a major newspaper website. He cited all the usual suspects, the escalating costs of ink and paper, and distribution, and labor, not to mention the fact that free news is pretty easy to find online these days. Everything he said was true enough, but I offered a simpler explanation. I told him that the real reason for the demise of the great American Metro dailies was environmental. The simpler explanation is that no one in the brave new digital world sets aside 20 minutes of quiet time each morning to sit down and read the newspaper. Wondering what happened to the great American Metro dailies is like clear-cutting all the old-growth forests from the Pacific Northwest and wondering what the hell happened to all the spotted owls. They went away with the trees. Same thing with the quality of life in the brave new digital world. We've systematically clear-cut the meaningful rituals that have compelled us for generations to slow down, to contemplate, and appreciate the good things and people in our lives. Over the past generation, we've systematically eliminated or marginalized the meaningful rituals that were designed specifically, unlike our digital media gadgets, to protect and promote the quality of our lives. We've replaced them instead with the rituals of our meta-addiction to all things media and all things digital. Turns out that addiction is simple chemical destiny in the absence of meaningful ritual. True, we are nothing if not complicit in our own addictions. But there can be no doubt that the drug lords and high priests of the brave new digital world are systematically stealing our time in exchange for a never-ending litany of false promises.
Meanwhile, those who would occupy Wall Street or stage tea parties need look no further than their own smartphones and the cash reserves and balance sheets of Apple and Samsung and Google and Yahoo and Facebook and Twitter and Microsoft and Disney and Discovery and Comcast and Time Warner and Viacom and News Corp and Verizon and AT&T and Dish and DirecTV and SiriusXM and Spotify and Pandora and Nintendo and Electronic Arts and Sony and Amazon and Netflix to explain the accelerated polarization of wealth and the ultimate destruction of the middle class in 21st century America.
True, the big banks and financial institutions are happily and eagerly complicit, but the populist war on Wall Street, however justified, is a mere smokescreen for the real power brokers. Follow the money these days and it will lead you directly from your own smartphone, tablet, laptop, game console, and HD TV to the balance sheets of the biggest digital and media dealers and their obscenely compensated proxies in entertainment, academia, and all levels of government. The high priests of all things media and all things digital extol personal empowerment while they compel us to work twice as hard and twice as long for half as much money. They preach community values and the American dream while they sell brute efficiencies of scale, destroy jobs by the millions, and shift trillions of dollars from middle-class neighborhoods and retirement accounts to gilded and gated enclaves. They tell us all of the things we can't afford because of entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and food stamps. But their definition of entitlement is shamefully and transparently self-serving, because what the wealthy and powerful elite on both sides of the aisle call entitlement programs are in fact nothing more than the table scraps left over from their own fathomless gluttony.
In the brave new digital world, true and enduring entitlement begins not at the bottom with Medicaid, but at the top, where Wall Street titans and corporate CEOs are awarded trillions of taxpayer dollars for grand larceny and abject failure. In the brave new digital world, true and enduring entitlement begins and ends not at the bottom with food stamps, but at the top in the hallowed halls of Congress, state legislatures, and city councils, where career politicians stop selling influence the moment they leave office, only to start buying it as highly paid lobbyists. In the brave new digital world, true and enduring entitlement begins and ends not at the bottom with Social Security, but at the top in the ivory towers of academia, where shameless administrators sit atop billion-dollar endowments and sports programs and engorge themselves at the expense of middle-class parents whose children emerge with a lifetime of debt and fewer career prospects. In the brave new digital world, true and enduring entitlement begins and ends not at the bottom with Medicare, but at the top, where the cult of celebrity deigns to inveigh against social injustice from the opulent cabins of private jets and convoys of armored Cadillac Escalades en route to global warming conferences.
In the brave new digital world, so powerful is our meta-addiction to the digital media and digital media devices in our lives that we are willing to spend hundreds of billions of dollars per year to buy media narcotics in amounts no one can possibly consume. Think about it. With every other narcotic, we consume all of what we pay for. We consume all of the liquor we buy. We consume all of the heroin and all of the OxyContin and all of the cocaine and all of the methamphetamines we buy. We consume all of them. But not so with media. Not one of us can possibly consume all the media narcotics we pay for each month. Now that's a powerful addiction. True, we are nothing if not complicit in our own addictions. But there can be no doubt that the drug lords and high priests of the brave new digital world are systematically stealing our money in exchange for a never-ending litany of false promises. In the brave new digital world, our meta-addiction to the digital media and digital devices in our lives wraps itself in the institutionalized sales language and imagery of personal empowerment, freedom, and democracy. But the true bias of digital technology isn't personal empowerment, it isn't freedom, and it certainly isn't democracy. The true bias of digital technology is the efficient and accelerated consolidation of institutional power and wealth among those institutions, corporations and government agencies alike, already far too powerful and far too wealthy. The true bias of digital technology benefits most those massive corporations and government agencies that singly and together already manage and manipulate terabytes of data each and every day.
In the early 1980s, 90% of all American media was owned by an estimated 50 companies. Today, barely one generation later, only 6 companies control more than 90% of all American media. And only 2 companies control more than 60% of all online advertising revenue.
In the brave new digital world, we champion big government as the antidote to big business, when in fact big government and big business are merely flip sides of the same corporatist coin. Big business versus big government is just one of the many grand but entirely specious narratives designed to protect and promote the power and wealth of an unelected aristocracy of high-tech media elite. What we call government regulation these days is in fact corporatism at work, little more than a tool-driven marriage of convenience among incestuous alumni of the same Ivy League MBA programs. Witness the fact that the financial institutions deemed too big to fail back in 2008 are, for the most part, twice the size and only half as accountable today. Not in spite, but precisely because of government regulation. Contrary to what the ruling elite, drug lords, and high priests of the brave new digital world tell us time and again, too big to fail isn't the unintended consequence of a lousy plan or a failure to plan. Too big to fail is the plan.
Nowhere in the brave new digital world is the collusion of corporate and government power more evident than in the press, the self-proclaimed watchdogs of democracy. But where were the watchdogs of democracy when both houses of Congress voted overwhelmingly in 1964 to prosecute a murderous war in Vietnam based on a fabricated attack on a US warship in the Gulf of Tonkin? Where were the watchdogs of democracy when both houses of Congress voted overwhelmingly for the disastrous Telecommunications Act of 1996 that effectively ceded all but total control of the media and entertainment industries to a handful of corporate giants? Where were the watchdogs of democracy when both houses of Congress voted overwhelmingly to invade Iraq and destroy Saddam Hussein's non-existent weapons of mass destruction? Where were the watchdogs of democracy when both houses of Congress voted overwhelmingly to reward our largest financial institutions with trillions of taxpayer dollars for their duplicity in the 2008 collapse of the housing and credit markets? Where were the watchdogs of democracy while municipal and corporate leaders in Detroit stole their city blind and forced it into the largest civil bankruptcy in our nation's history? Where are the watchdogs of democracy while municipal and corporate leaders preside over unprecedented murder and mayhem in the South Side of Chicago? Where are the watchdogs of democracy while the NSA and the intelligence community collude with global corporate interests to operate an entirely unaccountable dark state with the power to eavesdrop on every phone conversation and track every online click?
As it turns out, there's a perfectly good reason why campaign finance reform remains forever fixed on where or whom political campaign contributions may or may not come from, instead of where they always seem to wind up, in the very deep pockets of big media drug lords. There's a perfectly good reason why so many of us no longer trust the major news media, why they can no longer even feign impartiality, and why they are consigned instead to reconcile themselves to their true and original calling as partisan, self-serving hacks. There's a perfectly good reason why secular fascism and radio both emerged at the same time in the early 20th century. As it turns out, the watchdogs of democracy have never truly risen above or beyond their own DNA as the lapdogs of corporatism and the leading purveyors of fake news all along.
Meanwhile, our corporatist masters and oligarchs have quietly and efficiently amassed the world's largest prison population, militarized our urban police, and all but obliterated personal privacy in order to satisfy the insatiable appetites of Homeland Security and the digital media industry for more and more personal data. All in all, a perfect recipe for the rise and enforcement of a brave new digital world via an equally perfect delivery system, a state-sanctioned meta-addiction to all things media and all things digital.
The first freedom stolen from us by all addictions, regardless of the narcotic, is the freedom to walk away, the freedom not to participate. True, we are nothing if not complicit in our own addictions. But there can be no doubt that the drug lords and high priests of the brave new digital world are systematically stealing our freedom in exchange for a never-ending litany of false promises. The real story of the brave new digital world is a story about the banality of evil that rises like a dark cloud of drones in the absence of critical thought. In the brave new digital world, critical thought is replaced by endless narcotic spectacle, ever louder, ever more invasive, ever more relentless, and ever more powerful.
In the brave new digital world, we sacrifice our capacity for critical thought on the altar of the next fix, with every breaking news alert on cable TV, with every Snapchat photo, every text, every Facebook like, and every tweet. Like all narcotics, they offer succor and validation to keep us firmly ensconced in our addicted stupor, at least for the next few minutes.
All addictions, regardless of the narcotic, breed narcissism, insularity, and isolation. They turn us inward. Our meta-addiction to all things media and all things digital is no different. It keeps us trapped in a self-imposed prison of narcissistic narcosis. Eventually, as we spend more and more time in the solitary confinement of our addictions, we lose our ability to identify and empathize with others. Nowhere is this inability to identify and empathize with others more evident than in the current political climate, polarized and tribalized and trivialized beyond redemption. Here's the rub. Once we lose the time, desire, and ability to think critically, we lose our humanity and set the stage for the ascent of evil, unthinking and inhuman.
In the brave new digital world, we criticize and vilify the great religions as enemies of all things progressive. We ridicule them as sheer superstition and wholesale surrender to irrational and misplaced faith. Meanwhile, we blindly worship by the billions for hours and hours and hours each and every day at the temples of Apple and Google and Facebook and Amazon.com. Eat all you want, say the drug lords and elite high priests of the brave new digital world. We'll make more.
But the inconvenient truth is that in today's society of default digital addiction, the great world religions tolerate and promote far more meaningful dialogue and far more critical thought than the jealous God and high priests of digital media and technology. The inconvenient truth is that the demigods of 24/7 convenience and efficiency and entertainment turned against us in the early 21st century in the absence of critical thought, and have now emerged as endless narcotic spectacle, the banality of evil in the brave new digital world.
In our quest for endless narcotic spectacle, we have failed in recent generations to pose the right questions. We should have asked ourselves, what happens to the quality of life once addiction emerges as the default condition, the rule rather than the exception? We should have asked ourselves, what happens to truth once our meta-addiction to digital media and digital media devices takes over as moderator of all our debates? We should have asked ourselves, what happens to our democracy and our nation once we lose the ability to distinguish reality from virtual reality, or real news from fake news? We should have asked ourselves, how can we possibly maintain the integrity of our families and communities in the absence of personal privacy? We should have asked ourselves, what happens when we wake up one day to discover that our humanity is the weakest and least efficient link in a global market already dominated and ruled by machines?
All critical thought must begin with moral and ethical questions. Just as the spotted owls cannot survive in the absence of the old-growth forest, critical thought cannot survive in the absence of moral and ethical questions. In the brave new digital world, the most important and very first question to ask ourselves is not, can I do this? In the brave new digital world, the very first and most important question to ask ourselves is, should I do this? Thank you for watching.